And good afternoon, Frank here with a Tuesday afternoon episode of UFO News Network Sunday. We've got a fabulous show for you with a special guest. I'll bring in my co-host Chant Hannah shortly. But over the weekend, we had some significant news coming from the World UFO Congress in Barcelona. The string physicist, famous scientist Dr. Michio Kaku, sat down for an interview with Jaime Maussan and had some fascinating comments about the UFO phenomenon. Let's listen to a brief snippet of this rather lengthy 45-minute interview, but the key section came when Dr. Kaku said this.
Reproducible and falsifiable. Now the tide is turned, because traditionally scientists would giggle and laugh talking about flying saucers and UFOs. The burden of proof was on the believers. Prove it. Give me the evidence. Show me. Now the burden of proof has shifted to the government and the military. Now they have to prove that these sightings are not from outer space and another civilization. Several things have happened. First, we have videotapes. Videotapes taken by United States Navy pilots that are testable. We can now see and calculate how fast they move, how fast they can zigzag, what is the altitude. We know the parameters of these objects now. We didn't have that before. And so this means that the burden of proof has shifted. Now the military, the government has to prove that they are not from another planet. Now, they still might be hypersonic test vehicles. Russia, the United States, and China, all three countries are experimenting with hypersonic vehicles. But that's a big question mark.
And there you have it, quite significant. The burden of proof is shifted on governments around the world to prove that these vehicles, these extraordinary vehicles with their extraordinary flight capacities, are not from another planet. That is huge, and now it's time to bring in, we're going to cover this a little bit, it's time to bring in my co-host Chant Hannah to introduce our special guest for today.
Hi, Frank. Thank you so much. We have a wonderful guest, a very special person on the show today. His name is Zen. He's an author, coach, a facilitator, and owner and operator of several businesses. His contact experiences span his life, and his efforts to build community in ufology led to launching ufologyprss.com, which he currently curates. His seminal book, Stubbing My TOE, on Purpose, led to recent interviews with the thought leader and host of New Thinking Aloud, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. Zen Benefiel, thank you so much for having been on our show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome, and the conversation that's going to ensue, I think, will be absolutely fantastic. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely,
We're very privileged to have you on our show. I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the recent interview regarding Michio Kaku with Jaime Maussan, a friend of yours that you've known for decades now?
Well, first of all, I did listen to the entire interview, and I found it fascinating, although, you know, Michio has a way of expressing himself that's a very fundamental, almost grade school level, which is probably good for people because it takes very complex, intricately woven subjects and topics, and he presents them in a very eloquent, simple way, which is really difficult to do. What I found, though, in regards to the Kardashev Scale, this is something that I've been interested in for years, because it's obvious that if we have galactic travelers, then more than likely they're going to be at least what we know as type 3 civilizations. And this is only due to Kardashev's work early on and his classifications of such. You know, a type 1 is a planet that is able to utilize its energy. And Michio goes further to say we can control weather and climate and all that kind of stuff too. And that's probably correct when we have that kind of understanding that takes us to the point of the technology and its use in order to do so, which I might also add could lead to harmony among people and planet, which is the theme that I try to use in everything that I do in this way. Now, type 2 is one that utilizes the energy of its solar system. Michu talks about being able to travel around and colonize and things like that, and how Mars at one point was probably more advanced and earlier, than way earlier than Earth in its having its atmosphere and possibly its civilization, and then the eventual extinction of it. We don't know about that. There's another story about a planet called Maldek, which ended up being our asteroid belt and had similar circumstances where technology didn't work, and the guys that were using it basically exploded the planet. However, there was the Type 3 civilizations, at least, that were in the area that noticed what was going on. And Type 3, by the way, is a civilization that utilizes its galaxy. So consider the realms of intelligence, consciousness, understanding, ability to think, travel, build community, all of those types of things that, in my estimation, would be in accordance with what we call natural or universal laws of order, right? It just seems like that would be a natural thing to happen. So this Type 3 civilization then is able to just kind of watch what's going on, maybe even participate a little bit. Well, how might it do that? And would we see, traditional things that we might assume are such as ships in the sky, holographic presentations, communication, frequencies, all of the things and the various what we call contact modalities now, where these things might enter in. Being able to, for lack of a better, cognate that and at least be willing to open our minds up, which is kind of what Michu was headed towards, was, we need to look at this thing in a larger perspective. Now that we have evidence, military videos, for instance, we no longer have the need for disclosure in the way that we thought we needed it. Now, like he says, the burden of proof is on the military saying, well, these aren't, extraterrestrial craft, or these aren't craft from other worlds or civilizations. So it brings things kind of to where we can move forward in looking at, okay, now that we know they're here, what else is going on? Who else might be involved in the contact, quote unquote, scenarios? And what are they saying? Are they recognized as, PhD level educators or government officials, or are they the average Jill and Joe plumber, right? That may have some questions that others don't necessarily engage in order to expand their own knowledge and experience or wisdom, and trying to figure out, okay, here these things are happening. What's really going on? How can we integrate it? What's its purpose? What are their intentions? Do we have a reason to be afraid? And most of the time, all of those reasons to be afraid can be dispelled because, frankly, with thousands of years of contact, there's been no incidents. The only thing that's happened is they've shut our ICBM missiles off to say, hey, wait a minute, guys, you don't want to do this stuff, right? And I know Robert Salas, too. I've known him for years. And so these stories have been around, and this information has been present probably exclusively in the ufology community, but yet there's a spillover now where the public's getting more involved, and these kinds of events and questions and potential explanations are becoming more present.
I will be asking later on in the show regarding the Kardashev metric, a little bit deeper into that hypothetical, and that you brought to our attention, something that the UFO community likes to cover on a regular. I wanted to ask you, Frank, what are your thoughts on what Michu Kaku said?
Well, it's definitely what he's done is reframe the entire UFO debate. What he's saying here is that we've got physical evidence. So often we've heard people say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Well, we have it. You know, we've had Rich Hoffman on here talking in great detail about how much information they can glean from just small video snippets. We've had Kevin Day, the radar operator on the Princeton during the Nimitz case, talk about, you know, he captured radar. They've got this stuff on radar. And there's something out there. It's intelligently controlled. And Kaku is saying, yeah, we've got the evidence. The burden of proof is now on the government to say, you know, these are one of ours. These are clearly intelligently controlled vehicles. And, you know, if they're not manufactured by someone here on Earth, then where do they come from? And that gives us the jumping point now to get into Zen's wheelhouse, which is about contact and all that. And Zen, you've been involved in all that for years. You were talking about the contact modalities. What does this mean for people who are heavily involved in that?
Well, I'm going to pause the answer for that question and go a little different direction for just a moment to edify the knowledge and evidence base that we have that I hope will now come to the surface. Two things. One, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong's reports of seeing metallic cylinders on some kind of platform standing upright when they were on the moon. This has been floating around ufology for decades. Nobody really talks about it much anymore. I met Dr. Edgar Mitchell in 1997 when I was an event manager. So it gave me the opportunity to have multiple conversations. The whole thing started out with him pulling a pouch of drum tobacco out in our green room, which was outdoors. And I just happened to have one in my back pocket. So I pulled it out, walked up, said, hey, can we share some smoke? And it broke the ice in an unimaginable way, and we just dove into discussing the spiritual significance of tobacco, which led into Indian legends, which led into his trip to the moon, which over a period of the weekend and 4 or 5 conversations led to him sharing with me his experience of going down towards the surface in the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module. What he told me, and he's cautioned me, he said, you can't tell anybody this until after I'm dead because I'm under contract and things would get nasty if word got out. I just can't talk about it publicly, which I agreed to. So he says to me, you know, as we were going down towards the surface, these metallic silver cylinders came up and were spiraling around the LEM on its way down. He couldn't get an exact number, but he said they looked to be between, about a meter in diameter and a few meters long. Couldn't tell whether they were conscious, whether they were piloted, or whether they were controlled from the surface. He assumed they were controlled from the surface. But the one thing he was sure of was they weren't ours. This is from a civilization that had evidently been on the moon for quite some time that we either don't know about or keep secret. So that being said.
And that's a bit of a scoop. I appreciate that, Zen. Thanks a lot for that.
Well, it sounds incredulous. I must agree. However, why would Edgar tell me that? And, from my position, why would I confabulate any stories, right?
Right. Yeah, we've got exciting stuff to talk about without that, but with it, I've never heard that before. I was always under the impression that he'd said publicly he'd never had any direct sightings himself. This was, his interest in UFOs was based on him coming from Roswell and knowing about that, knowing some of the people who were witnesses, but he personally had never had any experiences.
And was he able to actually bring back samples of anything at all that was anomalous?
No, this was just visuals that they saw on the way down.
Okay.
And when they reached the surface, these probes or, whatever they were gone. However, it does edify the fact of what Neil and Buzz were purported to have seen many years prior. And I spoke to a gentleman the other day who happened to have a good friend that knew Neil, and they'd had the discussion about what they had seen, and she told him, yeah, he said it's true. Be that as it may, doesn't really matter, because it has no immediate effect on us other than it's just more evidence that I believe will eventually come out, and people go, oh yeah, we knew that for a long time. How come you didn't?
Yeah, just
Right?
to jump in, the astronaut James Irwin, who also walked on the moon, said is reported, not directly, but through secondary sources, that he had seen something on the moon as well.
Well, it stands to reason, that this would be a perfect place if there was another civilization observing us. That would be a pretty good place for them to hang out.
And sort of watch us land on the moon, which is a pretty cool thing, you have to admit.
Right. I have to wonder, though, if part of the reason we have not been back there was we were asked not to return until we learned how to get along. That's just my take.
Okay, and I don't know that I know that.
I don't either.
I've heard that talk.
Sounds plausible.
Yeah. We didn't do any damage when we were on the moon either, so there's that. So,
not that we're aware of, no.
Not that we're aware of. Well, I guess there were some plans at one point about nuking the moon and things like that. That seems, a bit silly.
I've heard of some experiments that were done firing projectiles into the moon to see if it was indeed solid. And reports are that there wasn't evidence that it is solid. So, which kind of edifies the whole story of Maldek, and that this sphere is more than it appears to be.
Okay, and let's move along and get into a little bit more detail about the contact modalities, because there might be a possibility, it's been talked of recently, of people using these kind of contact experiences to develop inventions, to move technology along. And what do you think about all that?
Well, from my experience, there are some potential, whether we want to call them catalysts or accelerators, and it spans the gamut from ethnogens to music and solfeggio tones and those kinds of things, that vibration has always had an effect on the human physiology and consciousness. So these kinds of things, as we explore further and understand, radionics years ago went into the frequencies of disease and being able to annihilate them or cause them simply by introducing a frequency to the body. This kind of technology, I think, at least leads us to, for lack of a better, assume that there are more possibilities with other frequencies that, for crying out loud, we send data packets through pulses of light through glass tubes. Well, what if we expanded that to other frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum that can store even more information and deliver it to specific individuals, and then allow them to have their own unfolding of that, which, in a non-linear, non-local moment, that seems like, forever in an instant. However, many of these kinds of communications, or downloads as people call them, take years to unfold, as the information that they contain is based on precepts of knowledge acquired in order to understand what's being presented. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, I know but that's how we build our knowledge base, and how we expand our ability to think and perceive and create. And in doing so, then we give ourselves kind of an opening, if you will, to other kinds of experiences. We learn that a lot of near-death experiencers learn that death is really not real. We don't die. There's an essence of us that continues, even though it may not be in a physical form. We can still think when we're not in the body. So many of those kinds of things, spiritually transformative experiences, are somewhat akin to those, where we open ourselves up to a more fearless place within us, which opens us up to other inner realms that we can then explore. And these inner realms have been talked about for centuries in all kinds of different literature and spiritual paths and all that kind of stuff, right? It's there. There's evidence. So now there's a little more of an en masse experience of that, and we're looking for ways to try to explain it still, right? Which is great, because that knowledge base increases, and then we begin to cross-reference ufology and science and spirituality and cosmology and like the title, the subtitle to my book, Stubbing My TOE on Purpose, is a seminal view of consciousness, cosmology, and the congruence of science and spirituality. Well, in my estimation, these are the kinds of things that we need to start looking for, because it appears anyway that there is no real threat from other civilizations other than our own.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Jung that man is the real danger there. So, yeah, you mentioned your book regarding your theory of everything, which is what TOE stands for. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's basically like Jeffrey Mishlove, amazing speed reader and able to retain the content by the questions he asked me during the interview. It was obvious. So I have a lot of respect for him. What the book covers is basically, it's kind of a pseudo autobiography that I chronicle experiences, thoughts, observations, questions, investigation, corollary information that comes from other sources that might edify my understanding. That doesn't make it completely true. It just makes it that it works for my understanding, right? So, the experiences, I guess, started when I was young. I was set up really well. I was adopted, orphaned at birth, adopted at 6 weeks, and then my parents bring an adopted sister home, and I was just a little over 4 at the time, and so they thought it was time for them to explain what adoption was all about, because there was no, pregnancy involved. Just all of a sudden I got a little sister in my arms. And it led me to really starting to inquire within. As a kid, I know that's almost unheard of. And yet I had those questions. I began to explore, and fairly soon there was a voice that came one evening that out of the blue that just simply calls out, "Hey, you." And so I heard it. Because it was so loud and so present, I felt sure my mother, who was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, I was on a landing looking out through the window over the front porch, I had assumed that she could hear it. And I spun around and asked her if she could, and she didn't. So I kind of had this awareness that I knew this voice was real and that somehow it was just for me. So I struck up conversations, and over the next couple of years, almost 3, I think, I had multiple conversations. I had my first out-of-body experience one afternoon that it helped me to have by just saying, I felt the fear of leaving my body. And as I did, the voice just said, just take a breath and relax and let go. So that's what I did. And then about a year later, I had my first experience of watching myself get out of bed, getting out my bedroom, or opening my bedroom window, climbing out, walking across the neighbor's backyard, to the fence that surrounded a 10-acre pasture. Now, this was rural Indiana. And then climbed the fence to the pasture, walked out into the field, and then my body started rising up into the air. Now, the one thing that I found pretty cool about the experience is I had an observer that was watching this. And so as my body started rising up into the air, I looked up and I see this huge, at least half-mile long, orange cigar-shaped cloud. And when I would get to the perimeter of the cloud, my observer became one with the body I was observing, and I would go into the cloud and wake up in bed the next morning. Couldn't wait to go back. So this experience was repeated, I want to say twice a month for a couple of years. Never was I able to retain what happened inside the cloud, which is one of the things I mentioned about the rollout of experiences and how long it takes to really understand, have the knowledge base in order to ask the right questions to garner the wisdom that was given at that time. So that's how things began for me. And at the same time, I was, pretty much a good student, an athlete, and, explored the woods close by the house and did all the things that a normal childhood and a normal, young boy would do, even up through high school. And then when I went to college, I had a pretty devastating experience. It wasn't physically traumatic, but it was emotionally traumatic. And I went back second quarter of my freshman year. I was living in the honors dorm, was in a pre-med program, but I hit my knees, and I don't know how many people actually pray, but I'll admit I do. So I hit my knees and I prayed, and basically I said, Father, I want to know what truth is, and I'm willing to die for it if necessary. And I really felt committed to that. And the following week, which actually was the same week that Travis Walton's experience took place. This was on November 11th, 1975, and I think his was just a few days later, or maybe prior to, but I know it was within the same week. At any rate, I'll truncate the experience. I was asked if I was willing to die for what I believed in. I thought of Christ consciousness first, dismissed that because it didn't feel complete for some reason, and went into cosmic consciousness. That sense, whatever it was, felt more complete, and so I said yes. And then the album that I was listening to, Journey's first album, had a guitar riff that sounded like a rocket ship taking off, so it made it real easy to leave my body. Turned around, looked at my body as I was leaving, turned back to look where I was going, was immediately engulfed by white light. Purest, most amazing feeling I have ever had. And even though I was asked if I was willing to die for what I believed in this place I could still think, so I knew I wasn't dead. And through staying there for a little bit in the conversation with this voice, I was taken into another place where there were points of light surrounding me in an indigo background, and a message was delivered. And then I was, at the end of the message, basically the voice said, trust and allow. And with that, I felt another rush of energy, and I'm back in my body taking a gulp of air. I kept my eyes closed for a while and felt myself reintegrating. And it took years to really understand that from that perspective, I'd had an experience of cosmic consciousness and the condensation back into physical form. So what do you do with that, right? and that's how, the questions really began. Is okay, how do I do this? What do we need to do to prepare? What are the signs that I need to be aware of? And these points of light, even at the time I was told that these were those I was to work with, they were definitely out of body as I was. And so, but I had a sense that they were also in body.
And why was that so traumatic for you?
It wasn't traumatic at all.
You were saying earlier that you had a devastating experience prior to. Okay, I
This
see what you're
had
saying.
nothing to do. It put me in an emotional place that I was willing to go deep and inquire.
The kind of cosmic ascension, I'm just going to make up terms as I go along here,
Sure.
that you experienced where you weren't an academic, you weren't thinking in an intellectual manner, which encompassed critical thinking. You surpassed that. You actually ascended to a point that was probably, I assume, in a purely spiritual sense. Is that what you would describe it as?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay. And
there's research and there's a description in, I think it's the Hindu tradition, that talks about going beyond mind.
right. And when you reach that superliminal state or that level of being that was just pure, a sense of pure oneness with all,
Mm-hmm.
did you feel complete? And if you did or you did you still feel the singular nature of yourself, or
Well,
did you feel that dissolve away?
that's an amazing question. And to answer that, yes, to both. There was a simultaneous feeling of complete oneness and individual consciousness because I could think, and yet I felt this overarching sense of unity with everything.
Okay. And then I have kind of an odd question for you. This Kardashev metric, this scale that is relied upon by many people, which is a hypothetical um, regarding energy that civilizations might glean from a star. That's my understanding of it. It's actually a lot more complex than that, but I'm just going to abbreviate it and say it like that. You're welcome to correct me at any time. Um, that's a very materialistic point of view regarding a possible ET civilization or civilizations out there relying upon some kind of energy source in order to survive and also traverse the galaxies. Now, my question to you is, how does that translate into the kind of situation you actually ascended to? And I'll explain what I mean. Why would ET civilizations bother with the Kardashev scale if they could have access to what you did?
They're symbiotic. And what I mean by that is material and spiritual coexist. The electromagnetic spectrum demonstrates that. The very low frequencies are more solid, the very high frequencies are not. In relation to how the Kardashev scale applies, on a type, well, we're maybe at a 0.5, right? We have the intelligence to know that there seems to be a bridge between worlds. Now, by that I mean, if our attention and intention is able to, or are able to affect our immediate environment, then does that not offer an experience of what quantum theorists posit as the process of wave to particle?
Let
Right.
me know. I want to interject with a question at some point. Go ahead.
Okay. So, but you get what I'm saying there.
I'm following you. Go ahead.
Okay. So that, Michu starts, or he talks about, why do we have a proton, electron, and neutron? Well, first of all, there needs to be some particles that are able to be brought into configurations. But what's driving that? Well, there's 99% space in an atom. And what's in that? We're calling it dark matter. Well, it's not dark matter. It's matter. And it matters because it's there. There are things that consciousness, the intelligence, the thought. We talk about speed of light, but we rarely talk about speed of thought. And there's very few references to that. One is basically the only one I've been able to find is in a quote unquote channeled work called the Urantia book. And it notes it as being 841 trillion miles per second.
Yeah, I have the book.
So if we, just using that, let's say it's not even true, but let's say that there's a civilization that's been able to garner its or the power and the understanding of its galaxy, and this consciousness evolves simultaneously with the ability to understand and utilize that, the higher order thinking, the understanding of how it's basically the law of attraction on steroids, right? Where our ability to think and perceive and to intend actually has an effect on the world around us and can be quite profound in certain instances. When people recognize these, most of them just call them synchronicities, right? Where a person is either thinking or talking or wondering about something, and all of a sudden that they're in shifts, and there's a demonstrable sensation within them in that shift. They actually feel an energetic shift that then reveals a new level of awareness or a new living awareness in that environment of something beyond what they had previously considered.
The implications of subatomic physics regarding the mysticism that we're sort of delving into here, I think may have been covered by the Tao of Physics, which was written by the high energy physicist, Friedrich Capra. And wanted to read a quote, an excerpt from the Tao of Physics that summarizes Capra's writing for his book. And that is this: the science does not need mysticism, and mysticism does not need science, but man needs both.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you again regarding the Kardashev Scale and ET civilizations that may rely upon that hypothetical, might actually use that part and parcel to actually traverse the galaxies, whatever galaxies those are, or universes, whatever. What I was going to ask you is, since man appears to, and I'm just going to stereotype here, and I'm going to generalize a lot of things, since man appears to occasionally delve into that very special perspective, and maybe it was an invitation for you, I don't know, from some cosmic something that allowed you to step up that ladder, to get into that subatomic area, that 1% of the 99% of nothingness, that 1% of something, and get into there. What I would like to know is, why is it ET civilizations need to rely upon the Kardashev Scale in order to get anywhere if you have the ability to get there? Now, I know I've already asked that, but is it possible that ET civilizations and man can only get to that point every now and then, that they cannot remain there in this physical capacity, in their materialistic forms, in their bodies, for certain periods of time? Otherwise, they'll dissolve into nothingness. And then they won't need their ships. They won't need their planets. They won't need anything materialistic at all. They'll just require themselves to think or to not think. Because my understanding is, it is this and it is nothing. It is everything and it's nothing all at once.
Great comments and wonderful question. To answer the first, or wonderful questions, to answer the first one about what's it matter to them?
Yes.
It doesn't. That's our way of trying to use a Heinlein term, grok creation, right? And what's beyond us. We've reached that point now to where we can actually consider that. We have the intelligence to do so. That doesn't make it right? However, we have the ability to at least move beyond where we are and try to perceive what else might be and explain it in some way, which is kind of what scientists do, right? So,
Yeah, it's really meant as a jumping off point to consider some of these ideas, like Dyson
sure,
spheres and the Drake equation and some of the other things that have been put forth.
Right.
Maybe
Right.
this is how they're doing it. Maybe it's a lot simpler for them. Maybe their knowledge is so advanced that they can be a lot more efficient. They don't even need what would a civilization need the power of an entire galaxy for? What would they do
Right.
with it?
to answer the second
Go ahead.
question Chan had about why this and why, the experience of nothingness and, consciousness is such that I see it this way. We need ways to experience our environment. And at that level, and there's some evidence in some of the writings from the 1920s, Guy Ballard, Baird Spalding, and even the Urantia book was eventually, that's when it began.
There is Madame Blavatsky also.
Oh yeah, Blavatsky as well. Okay, so there's these precursors, if you will, to
mysticism.
awareness of the ability of some consciousness is to be able to condense into form in front of them.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if that is true,
Mm-hmm.
then there may be other entire civilizations that are capable, and that maybe some of those appearances might even be members of those civilizations that are coming here and trying to say, hey guys, knock knock, wake up, don't mess with the atom, be careful, take care of each other, nurture yourselves, be aware of the ecosystems on the planet and use them wisely, and don't destroy yourselves in the process, which none of that we've really listened to.
Right.
And how we're faced with these things, and they are still there. This consciousness is still trying to say, hey, look, guys, start cleaning up your mess, and there's going to be all kinds of help available, not necessarily because they get involved, but because we shift our consciousness to a point where that energy shifts, and our ability to perform with each other in ways that assist the, for lack of a better, healing of our environment, ourselves, our cultural wounds, our planetary wounds, all of those kinds of things are still possible.
So Ray Bradbury wrote many stories regarding consciousness in different ways.
Amazing, right.
And like one example is there were some kids, they were watching TV in a room. I'm really oversimplifying here. And that TV, basically what they're looking at turned into an event where, there were lions, they were in a safari. And
tigers and bears, oh my!
The lions, the end of the story, everybody, just, I'm going to ruin it for you. The lions ate their parents. Okay, the other thing that he wrote about was, I'm going somewhere with this, orbs of light, and that were on a planet, and basically were energy beings, subatomic level of consciousness, that were basically kind of similar to what we're talking about, where you ascend to a certain point. You're not really a body, you're just some kind of energy type, or you're everything and you're nothing. Now, I was going to read something to you, and then I was going to ask you a question. Kardashev concluded his famous paper regarding a scale with this reflection. He said, and I'm going to go ahead and dip into what he said here because I'm not going to read the beginning of it. I'm just going to read an excerpt. He said, we should like to note that the estimates arrived at here are unquestionably of no more than a tentative nature. But all of them bear witness to the fact that if terrestrial civilization is not a unique phenomenon in the entire universe, then the possibility of establishing contacts with other civilizations by means of present-day radiophysics capabilities is entirely realistic. Now, what I was going to ask you is this. After we realize that we can really ascend to this non-tangible type of nature, and probably exist for an unknown amount of time. And immortality doesn't even enter into that kind of scale of understanding, because really that's the kind of understanding that we don't have total access to. It's
Or
unfathomable.
even partial at this
Right,
point.
right. But
But at least we are aware that it's possible.
what I was going to
There's
ask you
discussion
is,
about it. Yeah.
when I reflect upon my reading of Ray Bradbury, his novels over and over again, and I also think about the kind of technology we use right now to traverse our own space. And then I read this quote from Kardashev saying that the possibility of establishing contacts with other civilizations by means of present-day radio physics capabilities is entirely realistic. All of it sounds outdated compared to your having ascended some kind of amazing ladder of consciousness. That all sounds like it just kind of all falls away. It seems meaningless. And I was going to ask you, doesn't it sound outdated to you, all of our technology compared to what you went to? Because that's kind of that's kind of like some people call it high magic or high technology. There's really no term for it. Doesn't it seem like everything? And, this is the thing. I think some philosophers even became very depressed when they realized that there's a level of consciousness that they cannot attain on a regular. And it just seems like some people might take it in a very depressing way, that here we are in this physical form, and yet here you were ascending. How are we supposed to reach that?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? All the complication.
I
Our
don't.
technology seems outdated. We can't reach that level when we wake up. We have to go to work, that kind of thing. It just seems like 9 to 5 every day.
My first response would be no. It's not outdated. It's present.
Okay.
There are so many layers and levels of intelligence and capabilities. You've got. Look at the division of labor in a society.
Mm-hmm.
That's reflective of a span of consciousness, right? Some people think very highly. Some people, for instance, what I do or one of the hats that I wear in my companies is I do partnering workshops for pre-construction meetings. And so these are multi-million dollar projects where they'd be building road, bridge, waterways, hotels, all that kind of stuff. So these are all when someone first conceives, the architect designs, then the contractors and subcontractors and the rest of the stakeholders build the project. Well, that's a similar framework in which consciousness resides, and that's that when we have questions and we can perceive potential answers, or we receive snippets of things. We don't get answers until we ask the right questions. And the question is, are we asking the right questions? When we do, then the options arise with the answers that we receive to discern, first of all, observe, question even further. It's almost like Bloom's taxonomy, where the highest rung on it is self-evaluation. When we can really be critical of ourselves and how we think and what our belief systems are and how they affect our interpretation of answers, then we can get somewhere.
So do you believe that the fact that you ascended to a certain level of consciousness has practical application for everyday life, or does it just have a very lofty type of nature to you?
It has absolutely an application for everyday life, because what it leads back to is awareness of everything and the connection to it, right? So life becomes the ability of, so there's two facets. There's self-actualization, self-realization. Self-actualization is the outer world where you step up to your potential. Self-realization is the inner world where you step up to your potential, right? So you have a merging of those, and self-awareness is in the middle of that. It's like the right and left hemispheres being connected with the corpus callosum, right? it acts as a medium, if you will, to integrate those realities, the inner and outer. So when you can become self-aware enough to where you recognize the outer reflections of what's going on inside of you, then that increases your joy, first of all, because it just naturally does that. It raises your awareness. It raises your, for lack of a better, vibration. That word needs to have some other escalations or iterations. So the practical application of it is to become more aware of how you interact with your environment and how it reflects your interaction. It's like I was talking about earlier, the attention and intention can affect our environment. It brings people to us. We get phone calls from people that, there's all kinds of little nuances and specific events in our lives that we can identify where those things bridge. And we have an event, and it is in just a moment, but it's there and we can recognize it. Now, the trick is to build upon those in order to build the trust factor and allow the rest of it to unfold and become aware of it when it does. So when that door opens, we can embrace what's coming through it or not.
And you can kick your own door open, sort of like what you did by putting together the website Ufology Press. So why don't you tell us a little bit about where that idea came from and what folks can find over there?
Well, this was one of those instances. Okay, so I've been involved for years in ufology. Was at the first International UFO Congress in Tucson in '91. So when it moved back to Phoenix in 2010, I had a group of folks in our UFO discussion meetup group that I talked into getting a vendor table. And so for the next couple 3 years, we had vendor tables at the event. I was also involved with the town of Gilbert City Council at the time and promoting information and research of co-working and incubator space for them. And at one of their business networking meetings, I met a gentleman that owned a company called Mine, and they were developing wireframe curated websites that you could plug any topic into, and you could bring in RSS feeds, which is what the PRSS means. It's really simple syndication. So those feeds then are all brought into one location. He and I got to talking, and he happened to have an avid interest in UFOs. And this was in January of 2013. By the time the UFO Congress opened, I think it was first or second week in February, we had one set up. We had Ufology Press set up with had over 120 plus blogs and groups and radio shows and authors and all kinds of stuff. It was our example of a collaboration within the field, even though nobody seemed to be collaborating. Right? And I'm sure you experienced this. We're all kinds of different directions, and I was wanting to provide at least a virtual example of people working together, even though they were saying all kinds of divergent, maybe even conflicting things.
So basically, you built the template, and people who contribute to the site can log in themselves, basically through their own account, and they can add articles or links to their own articles if they have their own website, videos, shows, and so on.
Right. And it also has, anytime any of those bloggers or RSS feeds post, it's immediately available. So this is one source that contains all of these others. Now, what was funny, I brought John Rao, who at that time owned the International UFO Congress, and I showed him the site, and he had some nice things to say about it, but then went into, oh, you're never going to be able to monetize it, blah, blah, blah. What was funny is that within 90 days, there were a number of quote unquote UFO focused websites that completely upgraded. And many of them tried to replicate what we were doing. So in effect, ultimately we raised the bar, even though we still got pushback from most of the other players. It raised the bar for everybody, which was just kind of what I was hoping to do. I didn't want to wave a flag and say, hey, look at me, look at what we're doing. This is all about everybody. We're all involved here. And the sooner we all learn to work together and look at our common needs, not just within ufology, but individual and collective needs for survival and sustainability. That's where this is taking us. And this is what I feel most of the messages that the direct contactees are also relating, that, hey guys, we need to organize and get together and do things that are important for all of us and stop the petty infighting.
Yeah.
And you put your money where your mouth is, because it's a beautiful site, no question about it. Unfortunately, you had found it in 2013, at which point I haven't written too many articles since then. I've got some old ones that I am a member. I should probably, it would be okay if I posted some links to some articles I wrote way back when.
Well, every piece of information, you may have written it way back then, but does it make it not important now?
Yeah, if somebody doesn't know it, it's news to them. It's hot news to them.
Exactly. Many of us, from what I can see, and I'm not the only one by far, we were ahead of the curve. It was like, okay, you guys, then here's some information. You distribute it however you can. And initially, there was no internet. We did it through events and things like that back in the 80s.
Newsletters, they were big back in the day. I
produced and hosted a television show that took that understanding of, okay, what kind of fears do we experience? First of all, what prompts us to do what we're doing from both inner and outer perspectives? Then what fears do we encounter in playing that out in our personal and professional lives? How do we work through those fears? How do we see that in a collective human experience, and ultimately what advice can we share looking at that and in order to have better daily living? So I was doing this back in the 90s, and only part of which were interviews with contactees. I had Deputy Public Works Director of the City of Phoenix, a Vice Provost at ASU West, a Marketing Director for Western International University, the President of the Association of Afghans for Arizona. So I had a smattering at 120 shows over a 3-year period. So we explored the same motif as far as how do we learn to work together and help each other through the fears that we all have.
Okay.
For a drop off.
I wanted to bring up something that I know that you're overly familiar with. I'm just going to touch upon it again, but in a different aspect.
Sure.
In the realm of ufology, consciousness is a topic that cannot be avoided. It's absolutely important. I don't know why people brush it off. I've actually come across people who have somehow committed themselves to the topic of ufology. They're involved in science, and they actually actively and admittedly ignore the topic of consciousness, which makes no sense to me. Now, I'd like to give an example.
I can't tell you how many conversations I had with Stan Friedman about that.
Mm-hmm.
I love the man, dear heart, wonderful soul, but it was all science. He would not go into the more what he called esoteric stuff.
But it gives you an opportunity, though, Zen. He stays out of it. I think maybe he did more as he went on. As he went on,
I'm going to mention just a tiny bit regarding how he just dipped his toe into the water of consciousness regarding the topic of ufology. I'll mention it, and that is when he did an interview with a gentleman. His name escapes me, of course, right now, but he actually mentioned how Barney Hill was talking about how an ET presence was actually talking to him through telekinesis, and
Right.
And so that's a form, of course, I know you know this. I'm not teaching you anything. I'm just letting our listeners know that is a form of consciousness. That's just a slice of it.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so Stanton was talking about that, and he believed Barney Hill, and he brought that up as a point. So I know that he did delve into it a little bit, but you're right.
Yeah.
Probably could have talked about it a lot more. Now, the reason why I'm bringing it up to you, because you're an expert on it, in my opinion, what I was going to ask you is, at what point did the tide turn for the ufology community and actually decide to start introducing and engaging the topic of consciousness into the realm of ufology? I ask this because this is just one example of many. We've interviewed so many people, but just one example of many. Paula Harris, who admitted that after decades of not really getting too deeply involved in the topic of consciousness, decided to go ahead and engage in it full force recently. Now, why have so many people, whether they're high profile in the ufology community or not, but have really studied the topic for decades, ignored it?
Well, for one, it's an intangible. For another, but to answer your question of why the movement, and you considering me an expert, I've known all of these people for decades, and you can imagine the kind of conversations I've had with them based on our conversation so far. So I, among others, I'm not the only one because I've heard others, have been seeding these conversations for decades, knowing that something is eventually going to take place because it has to. At some point, the locomotive is going to run out of steam and they're going to have to look for another energy source, right? So it's happening. It's been happening for the last few years. One of the major efforts that's happening is the surveys and things that the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research in Extraterrestrial Encounters began. And,
Right.
I spent a weekend with Ray at the UFO Congress in 2014, I think it was, and got to know him. The work that he's doing is nothing short of phenomenal.
Yes.
Although Ray's kind of like a bull in a china shop.
Yeah,
we've interviewed him many times. I love Ray. Actually when we had him on recently, he was so he's not afraid to speak his mind.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I admire that about him. So anyway, the groups like that, individuals, collectives, are coming together to look at the next layer of what this whole ufology scene is leading toward. And just like the Kardashev Scale, it is taking the baseline information, the nuts and bolts, if you will, kind of like MUFON's been involved with for decades, and then moving that into the realms of more intelligent thinking and questioning about, okay, so these things are here, they're physical things. What's behind them? What's the intelligence? Jim Delatoso and I had multiple conversations. This was many years ago. It's like, we're not interested in the craft. We're interested in the pilots having a conversation. Who are you? What are you here for? What's going on? Let's party kind of thing, because we are that way. That we know there's this internal kind of intrinsic sense of fearlessness that we have toward these things, even when our ability to transcend fear is pushed to the max in some of our encounters. Right? There's all the, even the fear of death, right? Even though I went through that experience, I still, when I reach those places again, which I have, there's still those moments of, oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh, there is no death. Just forget it. Let go. Move on, right? Because, even like, I forget who it was in the early 70s that wrote about the silver cord and the OBEs, and maybe it was Monroe, that said, regardless of where you go, you're always connected and you will return.
Oh, you mean Bob Monroe of the Monroe Institute?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to mention something to you, by the way. Dr. Richard Haynes, who is a retired NASA research scientist and former chief of Space Human Factors Office at Ames Research Center, he also did, I think he did a paper on like something like 55,000 anomalous objects that he covered through his extensive research regarding
Speaking of research, I love how you do yours.
Oh, thank you. What I was going to bring to your attention is something that he said in an interview, and I wanted to get your response to it. So Dr. Richard Haynes was being interviewed by a gentleman, and this is Dr. Richard Haynes right here regarding the topic of ufology. This is what he said. That's my experience. In general, you are exactly right. I share your view that it is extremely multidimensional, so much so that traditional science is really not up to the task. Now, that's an insight that has come slowly over the years because I clung to science as a method, a technique to tease out these fine points and eventually get to the bottom of it. But the longer I'm looking at the evidence, the less I am convinced that's the way to go. There certainly is a part of the phenomenon that will yield to science. He's talking about ufology. But there is a whole other psychic or psychological dimension that not even psychology is going to come close to. I can see why a lot of my colleagues are in denial about this. The interviewer then says, it's simply too much to get your mind around. And then the doctor says, it's too much, that's right. So what basically Dr. Richard Haynes is saying is science is limited. It can only go so far. Then we have to rely upon something else. What is that we need to rely upon? Our senses, consciousness, a higher level of consciousness that you ascended to? What?
Well, first of all, I think science is still in the game, right? Science is based on the scientific method, being able to formulate a hypothesis, test it, reevaluate, and move on from that hypothesis, right? So that is consistent throughout anything. It's the questions that we ask, and I think what Dr. Hein is alluding to is that we aren't asking the right kinds of questions that lead us in the direction to expand our awareness and therefore our knowledge base. What happens in this, for lack of a better, somnambulistic state is an awareness that's beyond our capacity to think. It's like all of a sudden when you get an insight into something, you recognize it's not really your thinking. It just kind of pops in.
Yes.
Right? So how do you explain that?
I agree.
But yet it happens. And it happens over and over and over, and many scientific advances have happened because of that very thing. The scientists at Los Alamos, they first realized that their thinking about their experiments actually affected them. Huge. Okay, so there again, it goes back into the attention, intention, and action that then affects our environment, in that we can somehow read that, which we then can incorporate, what we might call the clairsenses, right? And there's a whole slew of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so quantum mysticism, I'm just going to bring this up. It's a set of metaphysical beliefs and associated practices that seek to relate consciousness, intelligence, spirituality, or mystical worldviews to the ideas of quantum mechanics and its interpretations. Quantum mysticism is considered by most scientists and philosophers to be pseudoscience or quackery. What I was going to ask you is this.
Quack, quack.
Let's just say quantum mysticism is fine. We're okay with it. It's valid. Do you believe that quantum mysticism, which is a set of metaphysical beliefs and associated practices that seek to relate consciousness, intelligence, spirituality, or mystical worldviews to the ideas married to the ideas of quantum mechanics and its interpretations, have any basis of reality or correlation to consciousness, the topic of consciousness and ufology. Can you connect the dots on that or no?
Hence the tail end of the subtitle for my book, The Congruence of Science and Spirituality.
That's why I'm bringing all this up.
Yep. Absolutely. You know, regardless of how we try to explain or the terminologies, the semantics, it's far too easy to get lost in the words and our interpretations of them. I have a great friend that's, he was a past president of the American Association for Alternative Dispute Resolution. He's also an Aikido instructor. He does a lot of high-level mediations and negotiations. What he had presented to me years ago was that conflict is never really conflict. It's miscommunication. The parties have different dictionaries of which they're trying to beat each other over the head with instead of trying to understand. So as a communicator, as an educator, as a presenter, as an interviewee, an interviewer, my job is to listen, ask questions, find congruence, relate to things that are similar, pull out the details that sound like they're saying the same thing a little differently, and expose them so that we can go, oh yeah, right? Rather than argue, which is inherently what happens because we don't do the back end of understanding the other person's dictionary. First of all.
Yeah, we waste a lot of time on traps of language arguments, that's for sure.
Right. And I found that a lot of times because my family, we have kind of a separation of intellectuals and academics. I know folks that are academics will take that as an offense to them. Okay, I'm sure you're intellectual. Okay, but still, there's still a separation in my family of intellectuals and academics, folks that are very bookish and stick to their reading and everything that they feel that they've gleaned from all the books they've read. And then we have another set of intellectuals in my family where they kind of border on philosophy and they like to just conjecture and speculate a lot of times and go beyond the borders of stuff. What I was going to ask you is, do you feel like folks that are involved in science, such as scientists on down, are ever going to go ahead and just relax and get involved in this topic of ufology, just like Michio Kaku went ahead and so boldly did recently?
Well, there's yet to be a chill pill devised that's good enough for them to do that. However, excuse me, it's coming. I see it. Look at what Michu just did, right? Mm-hmm. Now, whether Tyson's going to come along or Grayson
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
I always get his name.
But one thing I want to say, let me jump in here really quick and say something about Kaku. He has the scientific chops. He's got a very high profile. He's a very famous guy. But he also is one of the early adopters of string theory, has written extensively about that, has 70 papers, I believe, published. So when it comes to science, and I don't mean just ordinary science. I mean just having the degree and working in the field. For example, I believe Tyson is very involved in talking about science. Obviously, he's a scientist, but he's not been involved in doing a lot of research. He manages the Hayden Planetarium. So that's kind of his end of things. He's as much an administrator and a communicator as he is a scientist. Kaku, on the other hand, has more scientific chops, and I think might get more people's attention. At least I'm hoping that's the case at least.
Absolutely, and you're precisely right. Because of his acumen and his tenure and his notoriety, people are going to pay attention. What he just said this last weekend is going to ripple for days, weeks, months, maybe even years throughout the ufology community. Communities in here, like people, are really slow to move from one place to another en masse. There are early adopters. There are pioneers in every field. And, a perfect example, look at what Howard Gardner did with the multiple intelligences that he discovered and wrote about in 1982. They still aren't fully implemented in educational systems despite the value that they've been given.
I think it's important for our audience to understand the gravity of what Zen is saying here. Zen has been involved in the topic of ufology for decades. He has seen the comings and goings, sort of like a tide from the ocean, of folks coming and going in this topic, and also the topics themselves changing, and how deep people want to go and how deep they don't want to go. And it's just interesting to hear you talk, because you're also at a point where you are a historian of this topic. So I'm glad I'm able to actually kind of um, interrogate you about it and ask you, all these questions. So thank you very much for having allowed us to do that.
Yeah, and let me jump in here for one question. I did watch your interview with with Jeffrey Mishlove. I watched that, and you did touch a little bit on the simulation hypothesis, that sort of thing. I think it explains a lot, and I wondered if you could tell our folks what you think about all that, and do you think there's anything to it?
So you're talking about Tom Campbell's work and the whole avatar
the simulation, and we're living through a computer simulation, the Matrix, whatever you want to call it.
Well, that's a way of looking at it, because we're still limited. Like I said before, when you look at how we are able to, through our intention and attention and actions, affect our environment and essentially connect with the synchronicities that are always there that we don't necessarily recognize until we have those eyes open, right? That is an example of how this matrix or the avatar system actually works, and that this is what the quantum physicists have posited as the activity of the waveform becoming a particle, because we are indeed observing it, which means we are in effect creating it. So this is what Tom is saying, is that we actually have that kind of capacity as intellectual, as human beings, to become that involved, so self-aware of how we think and feel and perceive. And it sounds almost like, oh my God, that is just so much work. Right? It's like any discipline, martial arts or sports or any kind of, even academians, there's a discipline to doing the work. And how do we expect to make any progress if we're not willing to do the work? Americans especially want muck enlightenment. They want to drive into a McDonald's, get their sandwich, move on, and have everything they need and be, all hunky-dory about it. Well, that's just pretty shallow and self-serving and empty as far as the kind of experience that we can have by actually paying attention to guys like Tom Campbell and Robert Monroe and Michio Kaku.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up something real quick. I wanted to correct myself earlier and then ask you a question. I titled Fridtjof Capra as a high energy physicist. I meant theorist. What I was going to ask you is, do you think it's possible, Zen, the reason why some folks that are high profile in the ufology community for decades did not get involved in talking about energy or consciousness and marrying it to the topic of ufology because they did not want to get accused of acting new agey, so to speak, or getting
Perfect
involved
term.
in the
Absolutely. Absolutely.
but
I think that's the main reason why is because New Agers had always been thought about being all woo-woo,
right,
not grounded, so
yeah,
spiritually evolved that they're no earthly good and that kind
yeah,
of connotation. And that's probably true. When I first did my TV show back in the 90s, the guy that invited me to do it said, "Hey, you got all the contacts, we could do all kinds of new age stuff." And I'm like, I do not want to call it new age by any stretch of the
yeah,
imagination because it will tank us immediately. So we came up with One World, which is kind of a fitting title.
yes,
However, here I was working in an aerospace industry, and then as a production control coordinator in charge of $7 million a month, and simultaneously putting together one of the largest and first metaphysical conferences in Phoenix in 1988. Got interviewed on the radio. Didn't realize, I'm thinking, okay, people are going to be open and willing to talk about stuff and ask questions about the event itself. And I was being interviewed on then the largest AM station, KTAR, in the Southwest United States. And it didn't occur to me how much of a red state Arizona is. And the questions I got were never about the conference. It was always about my personal belief systems and who gave me the right to say this or that, and all kinds of just attacks.
Well, you were ready for that, though. Or
Oh
weren't
yeah,
you?
absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't expect it, but I'm the kind of guy who say, "Hey, look, I understand, and I'm just trying to share some information here, and you don't have to believe it, but everybody has the right to think on their own and decide for themselves and experience their lives in any way they so choose, as long as it doesn't harm another."
So I have a suspicion and a conspiracy theory that I like to share with you that I can't prove.
Okay.
And that is, I believe it's possible that intelligence agencies around the world, whether it be for first, second, or third world governments, actually suspect that there are consciousness aspects to the ufology phenomenon. And I'm just letting my other audience members know who are newbies to this topic. I'm not talking about unidentified flying objects that are drones. I'm talking about ET craft or ET civilizations here. That these intelligence agencies have already correlated consciousness to this topic. That's my suspicion. What is your take on that?
Why wouldn't they?
I agree. So why would they not? I feel like I know the answer, but what is your reaction? Why would they not share that with the public?
Governments inherently are there to protect people, and they hold their duties in sacred order, and generally will not allow information to leak that could cause mass panic. And with the fear-based belief systems present on the planet, it is highly likely that that kind of information will cause more reactions than responses, and they won't be good.
Zen, do you think that's still the case even after what we've seen over the last couple of years, where there is a lot more attention to the UFO subject, yet at the same time it's penetrating? We're all into it. We're watching every little bit that comes out, but maybe the general public not so much.
Think about the percentage of people that are actually involved with the topic in comparison to all others on the planet. We're lucky if we are 0.1%, maybe, right? Mm-hmm. So even though we are forward thinking, maybe even thought leaders in the field and the discussions that we're having, there's still people that have no idea, don't care, don't want to know. All they want to do is have their burgers and fries and live their lives in somewhat of a safe way. We in America experience that for the most part. Many other countries do not, by any stretch of the imagination, experience the kind of lifestyles that we have here in America. And foreign governments, the getting back into the consciousness and the communication and how might that take place, and the Kardashev Scale and the comment on the radio frequencies that you are used to communicate. The level of frequencies that many people, let me put it this way, when folks are engaged in a contact experience, and it even may cross most, if not all, of the lines of the modalities, there's a background frequency that if one has the ability to just stay present and quiet, it's there always. And at times it escalates in frequency. It rises as you move along that thread of consciousness that takes you from your own physicality up to the recognition of universality, so to speak. Right? You're finally able to release all of it.
Right. And folks can sort of seek that out if they choose to. They don't have to sit around and wait for it. I would think that meditation, there'd be some other techniques to try to access this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There are all kinds of ways. One of the correlated factors that I've found most recently are threefold, and they all involve 9 aspects. The first is the 9 planes of the multi-plane awareness technique developed by William Swigard in the 1950s. The second is the 9 solfeggio tones, and the third and most recent is the discoveries of Vernon Neppe and Edward Close and their, this is going to sound really bizarre, triadic dimensional distinction vorticular paradigm, which is a big word. And basically what they say is that consciousness, space, and time are tethered across 9 dimensions. So here we have 9 planes of consciousness, 9 solfeggio tones, 9 dimensions that are all interlinked. And that correlates to my direct experience. So I can anchor in that as being true for me. Now that doesn't limit it to just 9 dimensions, because there's more. That's just in the bandwidth that we occupy as physical beings. Beyond that, we don't know yet, because we're still figuring out what this is. However, one of the things I was able to do was to record a multi-plane awareness technique, guided meditation for lack of a better, that incorporates the solfeggio tones as well as binaural beats that Tom and Bob Monroe used for their early work. And that is on YouTube. You can, or even just Google the term multi-plane, you can hyphen it or not, and solfeggio. And you'll see a video that comes up that it's about an hour and a half long. So that's something that an individual, normally it's used, a facilitator, a trained facilitator does it. And I took the leap because nobody else had, to actually record it and put it out there to make it available for those explorers that want to take advantage of it. It may work for you, it may not.
Okay, and I'm looking at it right here. I'll put the link in the description of the video when I get it uploaded. But it is multi-plane awareness with solfeggio frequencies. And I'll give that a listen, hopefully tonight. No guarantees, but within the next couple days for sure. I'll give this a listen, because I'm very much into these types of different tapes, different recordings, and the different solfeggio tones. Very interesting, very good for brainstorming, that type of thing. So that we might have provided some self-help to our listeners today. So that's a good thing.
I wanted to bring up one last thing, just so it's kind of important regarding the idea of consciousness and ufology, but also just consciousness as a topic in of itself. One reason why the topic of quantum anything is brought up regarding the topic of ufology, and not just physics, just the standard, the classic model of it, is because, for example, Einstein and other contributors to the theory of relativity, they didn't inject the role of consciousness, but they did talk about the role of the observer. So in relativity, the term coordinate system may be substituted for observer without losing the value of the general theory of relativity. So because they didn't use the role of consciousness, I'm sorry, Einstein didn't, regarding the topic of the theory of relativity, he didn't need to, and it didn't devalue his theory at all. Then quantum theory came around, and that suggested that consciousness plays a prominent role regarding that topic. And so that's why quantum theory is brought up more regarding the topic of ufology. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to make it as simple sounding as possible. And Frank knows I'm not great at explaining things, all the time.
Well, that's why we have guests,
Well,
Right.
you do very well, Chan.
But that's kind of a complicated topic to bring up. But there was no need to inject the idea of consciousness in the papers that Einstein wrote, theory of relativity.
Well, it's like Descartes discovering the coordinate system. You just brought this up, right? He didn't have to relate to his distance from the ceiling, the thoughts in his mind that was going on, beyond watching the flies and trying to figure out, okay, how can I locate them?
Right, Rene Descartes, yeah.
Right. So once quantum, the whole quantum thing is yet very similar to this, only we're actually looking at, okay, what's our point of view? Where are we looking from? How are we observing it?
Right.
What are we observing?
And what's interesting, and I'm sorry to interject, but I do want to get your response to this, and then we'll wind down. But I was going to say something I know is obvious to you, but I want to bring up to our audience anyway, and that is the idea of an observer is really important. Obviously, that's like an understatement regarding the theory of relativity. Now talking about consciousness, obviously
Equally as important.
Yes, that's just as important. Consciousness is sort of like takes on the role of what observer does for relativity.
Right. It's like sentient beings are aware that they're thinking.
Right. So
Right.
Now what's interesting is the observer in quantum theory actually, and I know you know this again, I know you know this, actually affects the experiments if there's experiment to be had. So and that wasn't really talked about in the theory of relativity too much, as so much as quantum theory here, the observer is part of the experiment.
Okay, so let's take it to the next level. And,
Yes,
and yes,
yeah.
absolutely, the observer is critical but there's threefold. Okay, there's the
Yes.
participant,
Yes.
there's the observer, and then there's the source that's providing the experience.
Right, exactly.
Right? So, and that we understand as being undefinable as of yet, and yet we know it's there because we're observing the effects of what's there. Some people want to call it divine will, or some such things, and even become to the point of being deterministic. Well, as long as reality is malleable based on how we observe it. And there may be, a gamut or some parameters of the potential outcomes given a certain situation, but we still have choice in them. So the idea of it being fully deterministic may not fit. There's an evolutionary process of realms of behavior that we have from the point of, okay, we don't have food or water. What are we going to do? Right? Okay, now we got food and water. We don't have clothing. What are we going to do? Okay, now we've got food and clothing and we're looking for shelter. What are we going to do? And then it gets to the point where, okay, now we've got all of that and we're comfortable, we're safe, we have, city services and, everything that we need as far as food, clothing, shelter, medical care, all of those kinds of things, so that we're safe, and then we can now look to different things to think about, and maybe how that was all created, or why it was created, or who's responsible, or how did I contribute to it, or did I contribute? Am I a taker? Am I a giver? All these kinds of different things that we can observe ourselves in that place. And then, because we're able to observe, then we become aware, and we're able to make whatever changes are necessary in order to hopefully become more congruent with some semblance of harmony in our environment.
You had mentioned behavior really quick, and we need to wrap this up with this one. But you had mentioned behavior, and what I see in these UFO sightings, basically it's been pretty consistent going back almost 3/4 of a century now from different reports we've gotten from pilots and the like, where we're seeing, these UFOs appear, here I am, come chase me. They do, and then the UFOs kind of split the scene as fast as they can, which is a lot faster than anything that we've got can go. So we've got this consistent behavior, this kind of ambiguous presence here. Any thoughts on, do you think that might change, that somehow all of a sudden ET might say, okay, they've gotten to this level and let's be a little bit more open, or do you think it's going to maintain the status quo going forward for a little bit?
Well, like different layers of behavior, there's different layers of status quo. One might be that, okay, we know these things are here, we see them. Why are they here? What's really going on? Is there a way to communicate? Or are we just basically chasing shadows just to demonstrate that we're not able to keep up with them? Now, there's multiple layers or levels of thinking involved. One, a very materialistic, defense-oriented, are these threats in the sky that we need to consider and do something about? The whole nature of the sightings and experiences when those happen, I mean, you can't imagine the rush of energy and the excitement and adrenaline that's flowing through the people that are in those experiences. So for them to be able to then, okay, take a breath, relax, find your center, open up and see if you can communicate. That's completely opposite end of the spectrum of where they're at in the engagement of it. Right? So how can we expect that to take place? However, it is necessary to at least become aware that, okay, these guys are here, and ultimately they don't seem to be aggressive. They don't seem to be threatening. They seem to be just the opposite in some respects. If we can look at the ICBM silos being shut off in the 60s as evidence that they are benign, if not benevolent, right? And there are other instances that we can look at. But like Michu says, toward the government now has to prove otherwise, same thing occurs. The government has to prove otherwise that they are a threat, because the majority of us know they are not, or the majority within the experiencer realm. But that again is such a small percentage that we can only affect one person or a few people at a time, or at least have conversations like this where many others can have the opportunity to listen and contemplate and percolate and cogitate over what we're saying, and maybe come up with some new ideas or insights of their own.
That's what we're here for.
Frank, I still have one question.
Okay.
Oh, another one. Here we go.
Yeah, this is the last one.
Rolling.
And we have to be brief.
Okay.
Okay.
That's not going to happen with me.
I'm going to go back to what you said because it made a big impression on me. That's why I keep bringing it up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Don't be sorry. Be Chant.
Okay, I'm not sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
When you ascended to that level of all beingness, oneness.
Okay.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I don't know what to call it still.
When you were everything and nothing. I wanted to read something to you and just hold that thought because I'm going to ask you about that.
Okay.
There was a book written by a gentleman named Gary Zukov. He wrote
Seat of the Soul?
Well, I know you read this book already, but it's the Wu Lee Master.
Oh,
And
no. Okay.
yeah, and in this book, I'm just going to read an excerpt. It's just one sentence. It says, "The Wu Lee Master does not teach, but the student learns." Now, moving along here to 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by
Arthur C. Clarke.
yeah, Arthur C. Clarke, and the movie was done by Stanley Kubrick. Sorry, I was going to say Kubrick. I didn't. But anyway, by Arthur C. Clarke. In that wonderful book, by the way, the book, I just want to tell everybody, please read that book. It is so thin. The book is so thin, but it's the longest book I've ever read. Now, anyway, that book, The Monolith, reminds me of what Zukov says here when he says the Wu Lee Master does not teach, but the student learns. In other words, that monolith was there, and every person that came into contact with the monolith was learning something from it, even though it wasn't teaching anything. It was just there. Now, my question to you is this. When you ascended to the level you did, and I say the word ascended because I'm just going to use a proverbial going up.
Yeah.
You went up.
It's applicable.
I'm just going to stereotype it like that.
Okay. I can be stereotypical.
So when you ascended to that level and you were everything and nothing, do you feel like the source that you mentioned, that one source, was like the monolith where it wasn't teaching, but you were learning, or it was reciprocal?
Yes, to both.
That's a good answer.
All righty.
Okay,
So,
but wait, if you were able to have subjective and objective thought processes, then my question to you is, how different are we from being sentient beings again? I mean, if we can all ascend to that level and then think like a human being while it's happening, what is the point?
The point is the journey there and recognizing that it's one we need to take.
And on that note, I would like to thank you for having been on our show today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zen Benefiel. Thanks for coming on, and we will wrap this up and get on with our day here. I hope everybody enjoyed it. We had some big news and a great guest, Zen Benefiel. So by all means, go check out Zen's website. We'll have the link down in the description. Buy his books and read them, and get something out of that. And Zen Benefiel, thanks so much for joining us today. It was fantastic. Thank you, sir.
Oh, you're welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Zen.
Thank you, Chant.
Thanks
again,
a lot.
Long time coming. Beautiful people. Thank you very much. And I'll see you next time.
Yes, sir. We'll have you back for sure. Have a good one, everybody. We'll be back next week with another show. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.